The engine room of the Crisari warship Dawn's Fang thrummed with barely contained power, its crystalline cores pulsing like diseased hearts. Xander wiped sweat from his brow with a grease-stained sleeve, his hazel eyes scanning the diagnostic readouts that painted his scarred hands in amber light. The plasma conduits were failing again, and the Crisari engineers stood around looking as useful as decorative sculptures. "The tertiary manifold is cracked," he called out, his voice carrying over the mechanical symphony. "If we don't reroute power through the secondary grid—" "Silence, slave." Commander Vena's voice cut through the air like a blade. She descended the maintenance platform with fluid grace, her amber iridescent skin catching the engine's glow. At 6'3", she towered over most of her crew, but Xander met her luminous emerald gaze without flinching. Her silver hair was pinned back in a military style that emphasized the sharp angles of her alien features. "You dare question Crisari engineering?" Her melodic voice sharpened to a knife's edge. "A human insect presumes to instruct his betters?" Xander's jaw clenched, but he kept his tone level. "I'm trying to keep us from becoming space debris, Commander. The manifold won't hold another hyperspace jump." Vena's emerald eyes flashed with fury. In one swift motion she stepped closer, her elongated frame looming over him. Then she spat, a deliberate, humiliating gesture that sent warm saliva across his cheek. "Know your place," she hissed. The engine room fell silent, except for the mechanical heartbeat of the ship. Xander slowly wiped his face with the back of his hand, his hazel eyes never leaving hers. For a moment, something flickered between them. Not quite recognition, but awareness. Her amber skin seemed to shimmer with more than just reflected light. Then the alarm shrieked. "Ambush formation! Enemy vessels detected on all vectors!" The announcement echoed through the ship as red warning lights bathed everything in crimson. The Dawn's Fang shuddered as enemy fire raked across her hull. Sparks erupted from control panels, and the main power core began an ominous whine that every spacer recognized as imminent failure. Without hesitation, Xander dove for the emergency controls. His scarred hands moved with practiced precision, rerouting power, bypassing damaged systems, coaxing life from dying circuits. The ship's trembling steadied as he brought auxiliary systems online. "Engines at 60% and climbing," he reported, sweat beading on his forehead. "Hyperdrive will be ready in 3 minutes." Vena stared at him, her posture subtly shifting from rigid authority to something more complex. Her emerald eyes tracked his movements as he continued working, noting the sure confidence in every gesture, the intuitive understanding of systems that had baffled her own engineers for months. The Dawn's Fang leaped forward, escaping the killing zone just as enemy torpedoes scorched the space they'd occupied moments before. In the sudden quiet that followed their successful jump, Vena found herself studying the human slave who had just saved her ship. And her curiosity, she realized with a start, was becoming something far more dangerous. The bridge of Dawn's Fang buzzed with controlled chaos as pursuit alarms wailed their urgent song. Enemy vessels had materialized from hyperspace like hungry predators, their sleek hulls gleaming with predatory intent. Xander stood at an auxiliary engineering station, his hands dancing across holographic controls that most humans couldn't even perceive, let alone manipulate. "They're jamming our communications array," reported the navigation officer, her voice tight with stress. "Long-range sensors are being scrambled." Vena paced the command platform like a caged creature, her fluid movements betraying an agitation she tried to hide. Her emerald eyes kept drifting to Xander as he worked, watching the way his scarred fingers coaxed impossible performance from failing systems. "Hyperdrive efficiency is down to 40%, he called out, not bothering to look up from his console. "The quantum resonator is out of alignment, probably from that last hit we took." "Can you fix it?" Vena asked, then caught herself. She'd addressed him directly, as if he were a valued crew member rather than property. Xander finally looked up, meeting her gaze with those unsettling hazel eyes. "I can try, but I'll need access to the primary engineering deck and someone who knows Crisari quantum mechanics." "I'll assist you," she heard herself say, ignoring the surprised looks from her bridge crew. The engineering deck was a maze of conduits and crystalline matrices, dimly lit by the pulsing glow of the ship's heart. In the narrow maintenance corridor leading to the quantum chamber, Vena found herself walking behind Xander, noticing for the first time the way his shoulders moved beneath his worn work shirt, the confidence in his stride despite his supposedly inferior status. They reached the quantum resonator housing, and Xander immediately began his examination. His hands moved with the sureness of someone who understood the ship's soul, and Vena found herself leaning closer to observe his technique. "Here," she said, reaching past him to indicate a control junction. "This regulates the harmonic frequency." Their fingers brushed as she pointed, and both froze. Her amber skin was warm against his calloused hand, sending an unexpected jolt through both of them. For a heartbeat, neither moved, the space between them crackling with unspoken possibility. The ship shuddered as enemy fire found their range again. "Commander," Xander's voice was rougher than before, "I need you to modulate the frequency while I realign the quantum matrix." They worked in synchronized silence, their bodies occasionally bumping in the cramped space. Each contact sent sparks along Vena's nerves that had nothing to do with the ship's electrical systems. She watched Xander's profile as he concentrated, noting the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. "Got it," he breathed, satisfaction evident in his voice. The hyperdrive's whine shifted to a healthier harmonic. "Impressive," Vena murmured, and this time she didn't mean the repair. "All hands prepare for emergency jump," announced the bridge over the comm system. As they made their way back through the corridors, Vena's mind raced. The way he'd saved the ship, the quiet competence he displayed, the unexpected intelligence in those hazel eyes, everything challenged what she'd been taught about human limitations. When they reached the engineering station, Xander turned to her. "Commander, about before—" "Report to my quarters after your shift," she interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that masked her own confusion. "For debriefing." But even as she spoke the formal words, her emerald eyes held promises she didn't fully understand, and her voice carried a husky undertone that made Xander's pulse quicken. The chase had begun in more ways than one. Vena's quarters reflected her status aboard Dawn's Fang, spacious by ship standards, with curved walls that followed the vessel's organic design. Crystalline fixtures cast soft, multi-hued light across furnishings that managed to be both utilitarian and elegant. When Xander arrived for his debriefing, she was standing with her back to the door, gazing out at the star-streaked void through a curved viewport. "Your repairs held," she said without turning. "The quantum resonator is functioning at 97% efficiency, better than it has in months." "Crisari engineering is impressive," Xander replied carefully, remaining near the door. It just needed someone willing to listen to what the ship was trying to say. Vena turned then, her luminous emerald eyes studying his face. "And you listen to ships? Everything has a voice if you know how to hear it." He took a step closer, drawn by something in her expression. "Your ship isn't just machinery, Commander. She's alive in her way. She wants to run fast and strike hard, but she's been ignored too long." The space between them seemed to crackle with tension as Vena moved closer. "You speak of my ship as if she were a lover. Maybe that's what she needs, someone who understands her heart." Their eyes locked, and Vena felt something shift inside her chest. This human, this supposed inferior being, spoke with a poetry that resonated through her very bones. She found herself standing closer now, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes, close enough to catch the scent of his skin beneath the ever-present tang of engine coolant. "Tell me about your repairs," she said, her melodic voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Instead of answering immediately, Xander took another step forward. They were barely an arm's length apart now, the warmth radiating from her amber skin, making him acutely aware of every breath she took. "I rerouted the primary flow through the secondary manifolds," he began, but his technical explanation became something else entirely as he watched her lips part slightly. "The quantum cascade needed a gentler touch, more intuitive guidance." Vena's breath caught as his calloused hand rose slowly, hovering near her cheek without quite touching. "Show me," she whispered. Before either could lose their nerve, the ship bucked violently. Emergency klaxons screamed as an explosion somewhere deep in the hull sent shock waves through the deck plating. Both were thrown forward, Xander's arms instinctively wrapping around Vena to shield her from the debris that rained from the ceiling. They found themselves pressed together against the far wall, her amber skin luminous in the emergency lighting, his strong arms cradling her against his chest. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they simply breathed together, feeling each other's heartbeat through the thin fabric of their clothing. "Are you hurt?" Xander asked, his voice rough with concern and something deeper. Vena's emerald eyes searched his face, seeing a tenderness there that she'd never experienced from her own kind. "No," she breathed, but made no move to step away from his embrace. The ship's communication system crackled to life. "All senior staff to the bridge immediately. We've lost main engine power." Reality crashed back between them like a cold wave. Vena straightened, trying to reassemble her command presence, but her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her uniform. Xander stepped back reluctantly, the loss of her warmth like a physical ache. "Report to Engineering Bay 7, she ordered, but her voice lacked its usual edge. "I'm assigning you as lead repair coordinator for the emergency response." Xander's eyes widened. Such a position was unprecedented for a human aboard a Crisari vessel. "Commander, I—" "Don't question my orders," she said, but there was no heat in it. If anything, her tone carried something that sounded almost like trust. "Just keep my ship alive." As he turned to leave, she called his name softly. When he looked back, her expression was vulnerable in a way that transformed her alien features into something achingly beautiful. "Thank you," she said simply. The words hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to build, spanning the vast gulf between their species, their stations, their worlds. And in that moment, both realized they were crossing into territory far more dangerous than any enemy ambush. Engineering Bay 7 had become a makeshift command center, with Xander at its heart, directing repair teams with an authority that would have been unthinkable days before. The grizzled Crisari engineer, scarred and battle-tested, worked alongside him without complaint, occasionally grunting approval at particularly clever solutions. Human and alien crew members moved with synchronized purpose under Xander's guidance, their earlier prejudices forgotten in the face of his undeniable competence. "Reroute power from the recreational decks," Xander ordered, his hazel eyes tracking multiple diagnostic displays simultaneously. "We need every joule for the primary engines." Vena arrived to find her human slave. No, she could no longer think of him that way. Coordinating the repair effort with the kind of natural leadership she'd been trained to recognize and respect. Her emerald eyes followed his movements as he moved between workstations, offering solutions, encouragement, and the kind of intuitive engineering insight that her own officers had failed to demonstrate. "Status report," she requested, taking position beside him at the central console. Their shoulders brushed as Xander leaned over to highlight sections of the ship's schematic. The casual contact sent familiar sparks through both of them, but they maintained professional focus. "Main engines are at 30% and climbing," he reported. "We'll have full power within the hour, but there's something else, Commander. I've been analyzing the damage patterns from our attackers." He gestured to a tactical display showing the enemy fleet's positioning during their ambush. "They knew exactly where to hit us. Our shield frequencies, our engine specifications, even the location of our auxiliary power couplings. This wasn't a random encounter." Vena's amber skin seemed to pale slightly as the implications sank in. "You're suggesting we have a traitor aboard?" "I'm saying someone gave them detailed intelligence about Dawn's Fang." Xander's voice was gentle but firm. "Intelligence that could only come from someone with high-level access to our systems." Before Vena could respond, her personal communicator chimed with an encrypted priority message. As she read it, the color drained from her features entirely, and her hand began to tremble. "What is it?" Xander asked, moving instinctively closer. It's about my family." Her melodic voice cracked slightly. "My younger brother, stationed at the Peripheral Defense Command. The message says he's been arrested for treason, for selling fleet intelligence to our enemies." The words hit her like physical blows. Her legs seemed to give way, and Xander's strong hands caught her, steadying her against his chest. Around them, the repair crews continued their work, but the grizzled engineer glanced over with concern etched on his battle-scarred features. "This can't be right," Vena whispered, her emerald eyes glistening with unshed tears. "My brother would never—" "Hey!" Xander's voice was soft, meant only for her. His calloused hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts. "We don't know the full story yet. Maybe he was coerced, or maybe the intelligence is wrong." Vena gave a slight nod as Xander's hand touched her shoulder, drawing calm from his steady presence. The gesture was simple, yet meaningful, uncommon between a Crisari commander and a human of lower caste. But this time, she no longer cared about rules or appearances. What mattered was the sincerity behind it. "You don't understand," she breathed. "If my brother betrayed the fleet, then my entire family line is dishonored. I could be stripped of command, exiled, or worse. Then we figure out what really happened," Xander said with quiet determination. "You're not alone in this." The simple declaration, "we," sent warmth spreading through Vena's chest. Here was this human, this supposed inferior being, offering to stand with her against forces that could destroy them both. The trust implied in that single word was more precious than any gift she'd ever received. Around them, the ship hummed with renewed life as the repairs took hold. But for Vena, the familiar sounds of her vessel's heart beating strongly again were overshadowed by the growing realization that her own heart was becoming entangled with the most unlikely person imaginable. "Commander," the grizzled engineer called out, his gruff voice carefully neutral. "Engines are back to full power. Your repair coordinator has done exceptional work." Vena straightened, wiping away the last traces of tears, but she didn't step away from Xander's steadying presence. "Noted. Continue monitoring all systems." As the crew returned to their duties, she turned to Xander with something new in her emerald eyes, not just trust, but partnership. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The observation deck was one of the few places on Dawn's Fang where someone could find solitude. Its transparent aluminum viewport offering an unobstructed view of the stars. Vena stood there in the ship's artificial night cycle, her silhouette outlined against the cosmic tapestry beyond. She'd removed her formal uniform jacket, leaving only the fitted underlayer that revealed the elegant lines of her elongated frame. Xander found her there, as he'd hoped he would. The past few hours had been a whirlwind of repairs and tactical preparations, but his thoughts kept returning to the moment in the engineering bay when she'd leaned into his touch, trusting him with her vulnerability. "Can't sleep either?" he asked softly, approaching until he stood beside her at the viewport. "Sleep seems like a luxury I can't afford," Vena replied, her melodic voice heavy with exhaustion and worry. "Every time I close my eyes, I see my brother's face. I keep trying to understand how he could have done this." Xander studied her profile in the starlight, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself as if afraid she might shatter. "Tell me about him." "Chiron was my younger brother by 7 cycles." A sad smile touched her lips. "Brilliant, curious, always asking questions that made our elders uncomfortable. He used to say that the universe was too vast for any one species to claim superiority over another." "Sounds like someone worth knowing," Xander said gently. Vena turned to face him, and in the dim lighting her amber skin seemed to glow with its own inner light. "He would have liked you, I think. You both share that quality of seeing beyond the surface of things." The space between them felt charged, full of unspoken possibilities. Xander reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, his fingers found hers. The touch was electric, alien skin against human, warmth flowing between them like a current. "Vena," he said her name for the first time, tasting it like something precious. "Whatever your brother did or didn't do, it doesn't define you. I've seen who you are, the way you care for your crew, the way you're willing to question everything you were taught when it matters." Her emerald eyes searched his face, looking for deception and finding only steady honesty. "And who am I, Xander? Because I no longer seem to know." Instead of answering with words, he shared something else, a story his grandfather had told him years ago, before the Crisari conquest, about a human woman who'd led her people through their darkest hour, not through strength or nobility, but through her willingness to admit she didn't have all the answers. She saved thousands of lives, Xander concluded, not because she was perfect, but because she was human enough to doubt, to feel, to change when change was needed. Tears glistened in Vena's eyes as she absorbed his words. "Is that what you think I am? Human enough?" "I think," Xander said, stepping closer until their breaths mingled in the space between them, "that you're something new, something that transcends the old boundaries." Their foreheads touched in a moment that was both tender and intense, alien yet strangely familiar. Vena gripped the fabric of Xander's shirt tightly, as if holding on to the only steady point in a rising storm. When they finally stepped back, both were breathing heavily, the weight of unspoken feeling still lingering between them. "This is madness," she whispered against his mouth. "Maybe," he agreed, his forehead resting against hers, "but it's the first thing that's felt completely right in a long time." A soft chime from the ship's communication system interrupted them. "Commander to the bridge, priority alert." Vena straightened reluctantly, her command mask sliding back into place, but her hand lingered in Xander's for a moment longer than necessary. "Stay close," she murmured. "I have a feeling we're going to need each other more than ever." As they made their way toward the bridge, neither spoke of the boundary they had just crossed, but both carried the memory of that moment, like a quiet flame burning within. Behind them, the stars turned in their ancient rhythm, silent witnesses to a connection powerful enough to reshape the very foundations of galactic civilization. The enemy was closing in, betrayal stalked their ship's corridors, and the future remained uncertain. But for the first time since this crisis began, Vena felt like she wasn't facing it alone. The tactical briefing had lasted hours, filled with grim reports of the enemy armada's relentless pursuit and the growing certainty that Dawn's Fang was being hunted by someone with intimate knowledge of their capabilities. As the senior staff filed out of the conference room, Vena lingered, ostensibly reviewing star charts, but actually watching Xander as he worked at the engineering station, his modifications to the ship's systems earning grudging respect from officers who dismissed him as chattel just days before. "Your upgrades have increased our speed by 12%, she said once they were alone. "The quantum cascade efficiency improvements alone should buy us another day's lead on our pursuers." Xander looked up from his console, his hazel eyes meeting hers across the dimly lit room. "It's not enough. They're still gaining on us, and they know exactly which routes we're likely to take." The weight of their situation settled between them like a physical presence. Vena moved closer, her fluid movements betraying an elegant grace that Xander found increasingly difficult to ignore. In the soft glow of the tactical displays, her amber iridescent skin seemed to shimmer with its own light. "There's something I haven't told you," she said, her melodic voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "About my family, about why my brother's betrayal cut so deep." They were standing close now, close enough that Xander could see the vulnerability she usually kept hidden beneath her command mask. Her emerald eyes held depths of pain that spoke to something in his own soul. "The Crisari High Command values genetic purity above all else," she continued. "My family's bloodline is considered exemplary. My brother and I were both destined for positions of great authority. If he's truly betrayed the fleet—" "They'll assume the corruption runs in your genetics," Xander finished, understanding immediately. Vena nodded, her silver hair catching the light as it fell across her shoulders. "I could lose everything, my command, my status, even my freedom. And the crew who've begun to trust your leadership, they'll suffer for following a disgraced commander." Without thinking, Xander reached for her, his calloused hands framing her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "Then we make sure that doesn't happen. We find the real traitor, we clear your brother's name, and we prove that worth isn't determined by genetics or species." The intensity in his hazel eyes made something flutter in Vena's chest. Here was this human, this being her people considered inferior, offering to fight battles that weren't his own, to risk everything for her sake. The magnitude of that gesture left her speechless. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that for me?" Instead of answering immediately, Xander guided her toward the viewport where stars wheeled in their eternal dance. The sight never failed to humble him, reminding him of how small their conflict seemed against the vast canvas of the universe. "Because," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "you're the first person who's ever looked at me and seen something worth saving. Not a slave, not a useful tool, but someone whose thoughts and feelings matter." Vena's breath hitched as his thumb traced the elegant line of her cheekbone. The touch sent sparks along her nerves that had nothing to do with their species differences and everything to do with the connection growing between them. "Xander," she breathed his name like a prayer. Their second embrace was different from the first, deeper, more intense, carrying the weight of knowing that time was slipping away. Vena's hands clutched his shirt tightly, as if trying to draw strength from their shared presence, as though their souls might hold together what the universe threatened to tear apart. When they finally let go, both were trembling. "This is impossible," she whispered against his mouth, but made no move to pull away. "Most of the best things are," he replied, his forehead resting against hers. A soft footstep in the corridor made them spring apart just as one of her junior officers appeared in the doorway. The young Cresari's expression was carefully neutral, but Vena could see the questions in his eyes. "Commander," he reported formally, "we've received new intelligence about the enemy fleet's composition. It appears they've been reinforced." "I'll be right there," Vena replied, her command voice steady despite the racing of her heart. As the officer departed, she turned back to Xander, her emerald eyes bright with unshed tears and something that might have been hope. "Stay close to me," she murmured, echoing her words from the previous night. "Whatever comes next, I want you at my side." The promise hung between them like a bridge spanning the gulf between their worlds, built of trust, desire, and the growing certainty that their hearts had become quantum entangled across all the barriers that should have kept them apart. Outside the viewport, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the small dramas of mortals. But within the metal walls of Dawn's Fang, two hearts beat in synchronized rhythm, and the universe itself seemed to hold its breath. The mess hall buzzed with tension as Xander stood before an assembly of Dawn's Fang's crew, human slaves and Cresari alike. Word of his unconventional tactics had spread throughout the ship, creating a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and barely concealed hostility. At the room's edge, Vena watched with carefully controlled expression, her emerald eyes tracking every reaction to the human who'd somehow become central to their survival. "The enemy knows our standard evasion patterns," Xander began, his voice carrying the quiet authority he'd discovered in himself. "They're herding us toward the Kythara Nebula, where their superior numbers will trap us in a pincer movement." A Cresari tactical officer, his orange skin marked with the scars of previous battles, stood abruptly. "You presume to lecture us on naval strategy, human? My people were commanding star fleets when yours were still grubbing in planetary dirt." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to see how this confrontation would resolve. Xander met the officer's hostile gaze steadily, his hazel eyes betraying no anger, only patient determination. "You're right," he said simply. "Your people have centuries of tactical experience, but they also have centuries of tactical predictability. The enemy isn't just fighting Dawn's Fang, they're fighting the entire Cresari strategic doctrine." He gestured to the holographic display where the enemy formation moved like predators closing on wounded prey. "But humans, we're unpredictable. We improvise. We turn disadvantages into weapons." From across the room, the grizzled engineer who'd become his unlikely ally grunted approval. "The human speaks truth. His modifications doubled our shield efficiency using spare parts and salvaged components." "Modifications that violate every principle of proper engineering," the tactical officer snapped. "Modifications that work," Vena interjected, her melodic voice cutting through the argument like a blade. She moved to stand beside Xander, her presence lending weight to his words. "I'm assigning him as tactical consultant for the upcoming engagement." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. A human slave, regardless of his recent contributions, being given such authority was unprecedented in Cresari military history. Commander, the tactical officer's voice was tight with barely controlled outrage. Surely you cannot be serious. The crew will never accept orders from someone who saved this ship twice in the past 3 days. Vena's tone was dangerously quiet. Someone whose innovations have kept us ahead of superior enemy forces, or are you suggesting that genetic heritage matters more than competence? The challenge hung in the air like a drawn blade. Xander felt the weight of dozens of gazes, measuring him, judging him, trying to reconcile everything they'd been taught about human limitations with the evidence before their eyes. Then the ship's alert klaxons began to wail. Enemy contact! All hands to battle stations. The room emptied in controlled chaos as crew members rushed to their posts. Xander found himself moving toward the bridge alongside Vena, their shoulders brushing in the narrow corridor. The casual contact sent familiar sparks through both of them, but the approaching battle demanded their full attention. "Are you ready for this?" Vena asked quietly as they reached the bridge entrance. "No," Xander admitted, then smiled with a confidence that transformed his entire face. "But I don't think that matters anymore." The bridge of Dawn's Fang was a symphony of controlled urgency as they took their positions. On the main display, enemy vessels emerged from hyperspace like angry hornets, their formations precise and deadly. Xander studied their approach vectors, his mind racing through possibilities. "They're trying to force us into the nebula's ionization field," he announced. "Standard Crisari doctrine would dictate evasive pattern Delta 7. "Then that's what we'll do," the tactical officer said, his hands moving toward the control interface. "No," Xander's voice was firm. "That's what they expect. Instead, we're going straight at them." The bridge fell silent except for the hum of the ship's systems. Even Vena looked startled by the suggestion. "Explain," she ordered. "They've positioned themselves to counter our evasion patterns, but they're not prepared for a direct assault. If we hit their formation at maximum velocity, using the nebula's ionization to mask our approach until the last second." "We'll take massive damage," the tactical officer protested. "From their forward batteries, yes, but their main guns are positioned for a prolonged engagement, not a high-speed pass. We punch through their line, disable their command ship, and escape while they're regrouping." Xander's hands danced over the tactical display, highlighting weak points in the enemy formation that Crisari doctrine would never have identified. His unconventional thinking illuminated possibilities that centuries of military tradition had made invisible. Vena studied the projection, her emerald eyes bright with understanding. "It's insane," she said slowly, "and it might just work." She turned to face her crew. "All stations prepare for attack pattern Human Alpha." As Dawn's Fang accelerated toward what appeared to be certain destruction, Xander felt Vena's hand brush against his, a brief contact that spoke of trust, partnership, and something deeper than either dared name aloud. The stars wheeled around them as they hurtled toward their destiny, two hearts beating in defiance of impossible odds. Dawn's Fang screamed through space at velocities that made her hull plating glow cherry red, diving toward the enemy formation like a meteor aimed at the heart of a storm. On the bridge, Xander stood at the tactical station with Vena beside him, their bodies pressed close as they worked in perfect synchronization, calling out commands and adjustments that kept their impossible gambit from becoming a suicide run. "Enemy targeting systems are locking on," reported the navigation officer, her voice tight with professional calm that barely masked her terror. "Let them," Xander replied, his hazel eyes locked on the tactical display. "They're expecting us to break off. When we don't, they'll hesitate for just a moment. That's our window." The main screen showed the enemy vessels growing larger with terrifying speed, their weapon ports glowing with stored energy. At their current velocity, Dawn's Fang would reach the enemy line in less than 90 seconds. 80 seconds to contact," Vena announced, her melodic voice carrying across the bridge with absolute authority. "All hands brace for combat maneuvering." Xander's fingers flew over his console, routing power through systems that hadn't been designed to handle such loads, pushing the ship's capabilities beyond every safety protocol. The modifications he'd made over the past days held true. systems that should have failed under such stress continuing to function through sheer mechanical determination. "Target the command vessel," he ordered, highlighting the largest enemy ship on the display. "If we can disable their coordination, their formation falls apart." 60 seconds to contact. Enemy is firing. Space around Dawn's Fang erupted in deadly flowers of light as enemy weapons reached out toward them. The ship bucked and twisted as Xander's unpredictable flight pattern took them through the killing field, but several hits still found their mark. Sparks showered from overhead panels, and the artificial gravity flickered ominously. "Shields down to 40%, came the damage report. "Hold course," Xander commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Beside him, Vena's amber skin was luminous with perspiration, her emerald eyes reflecting absolute trust in his judgment. 30 seconds to contact, adjusting approach vector. The enemy command ship loomed ahead of them now, its sleek hull bristling with weapon emplacements. At the last possible moment, Xander triggered the attack sequence he'd programmed. Not a conventional assault, but something far more audacious. "Launching emergency repair drones," he announced, modified for kinetic impact. The small maintenance robots that normally patched hull breaches had been jury-rigged with explosive charges and guidance systems. They struck the enemy vessel's shield generators in perfect sequence, each detonation precisely timed to cascade through the ship's defensive grid. "Their shields are down," someone shouted. "Now," Vena commanded. Dawn's Fang screamed through space at velocities that made her hull plating glow cherry red, diving toward the enemy formation like a meteor aimed at the heart of a storm. On the bridge, Xander stood at the tactical station with Vena beside him, their bodies pressed close as they worked in perfect synchronization, calling out commands and adjustments that kept their impossible gambit from becoming a suicide run. The ship shuddered violently as the first wave of enemy fire slammed into their shields. Warning lights flared across the bridge, painting the faces of the Crisari crew in urgent crimson. The main view screen flickered, showing the enemy command ship, the Ironclad, growing impossibly large, its weapon ports spitting death. "Shields down to 15%, the navigation officer cried, her voice strained. "Hull integrity failing on port side." "Hold course," Xander roared, his voice cutting through the cacophony. He slammed his hand down on a console, rerouting auxiliary power to the forward deflectors. "Vena, prepare for evasive maneuver Gamma 9 Omega, now!" Vena's emerald eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, met his. There was no hesitation. "Gamma 9 Omega, execute!" she commanded, her voice ringing with newfound authority. The Dawn's Fang twisted with a sickening lurch, a maneuver so sharp it threatened to tear the ship apart. The Ironclad's massive main cannons, designed for a broadside engagement, overshot their target by a hair's breadth. The energy blast seared past their hull, close enough to make the bridge air crackle with ozone. "That was too close," the tactical officer gasped, clutching his console. "Too close for them," Xander countered, a grim smile touching his lips. "Their targeting systems are calibrated for Crisari predictability. They didn't account for a sudden radical shift in vector." "Launch all remaining drones," Vena ordered, her eyes fixed on the Ironclad. "Target their bridge, their engine core, everything." The remaining modified repair drones, now armed with more potent charges and guided by Xander's hastily programmed algorithms, streaked out from Dawn's Fang's launch bays. They were tiny, almost invisible against the vastness of space, but they were precise. One by one, they slammed into the Ironclad's exposed sections, the very areas Xander had identified as weak points in his earlier analysis. Explosions blossomed across the enemy vessel's hull, not massive, but strategically placed. Multiple internal explosions on the Ironclad, a sensor officer shouted, his voice laced with awe. "Their bridge is compromised. Engine core destabilizing." "They're breaking formation," another cried. "The enemy fleet is scattering." A wave of stunned silence washed over the bridge. The impossible had happened. A single Crisari warship, guided by a human slave, had shattered the core of an enemy armada. "Damage report, all stations," Vena finally managed, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed emotion. "Hull integrity at 7%, Commander," the navigation officer reported, "but the structural integrity fields are holding. Engines are stable, though heavily strained. We're clear of the immediate threat." Xander leaned against his console, breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly draining from his system. He felt Vena's hand on his arm, her touch light but firm. He looked at her, and in her emerald eyes he saw not just relief, but a profound respect that transcended their species. "We did it," he murmured, a genuine smile finally breaking through his fatigue. "We did," Vena echoed, her own smile radiant, "and now we find out who betrayed us." The journey back to Crisari High Command space was tense. While the immediate threat was neutralized, the larger conspiracy remained. Xander and Vena spent countless hours in the Dawn's Fang's secure data core, sifting through encrypted communications logs and ship manifests. Xander's intuitive understanding of complex systems, combined with Vena's intimate knowledge of Crisari protocols and her family's history, proved an unstoppable combination. They discovered a pattern. Subtle data packets, seemingly innocuous, routed through a series of compromised civilian vessels before being transmitted to the enemy. The origin point was always within Crisari territory, and the data itself was highly specific, detailing Dawn's Fang's unique modifications and Vena's tactical preferences. "It's not Chiron," Vena whispered one cycle, her finger tracing a complex data trail on the holographic display. "This level of access, this specific knowledge of Dawn's Fang, it points to someone much higher up." Xander nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. "And the timing of the data leaks aligns perfectly with the Ironclad's movements. This wasn't just intelligence gathering, it was active coordination." Their investigation led them down a rabbit hole of political intrigue and hidden agendas. They uncovered evidence of a rogue faction within the Crisari High Command itself, a group disillusioned with the current leadership and seeking to destabilize the Empire through controlled conflict, hoping to install their own puppet regime. Chiron, Vena's brother, had been a pawn, framed to discredit Vena's family and remove a potential obstacle to their plans. He had indeed been coerced, his access exploited, but he was no traitor. "The evidence is undeniable," Xander stated, compiling the final report. "Admiral Vorlag, he's the mastermind, and he used Chiron as a scapegoat." Vena's face was a mask of grim determination. "Vorlag, he was a mentor to my father. This is a betrayal of the highest order." Presenting their findings to the Crisari High Command was a perilous undertaking. Xander, a human slave, stood beside Commander Vena, a disgraced officer, as they laid out their case. The chamber was filled with the stern, unyielding faces of Crisari elders, their expressions ranging from skepticism to outright hostility. "You accuse Admiral Vorlag, a decorated officer of the fleet, based on the testimony of a human chattel?" one elder boomed, his voice laced with disdain. "The evidence speaks for itself, Elder," Vena replied, her voice steady and clear. "And the human you dismiss as chattel saved Dawn's Fang and exposed the true enemy within our ranks. His insights, unburdened by centuries of Crisari dogma, allowed us to see what was hidden in plain sight." Xander then stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the Crisari leaders. "My people have a saying, the truth will out. We've provided the data, the patterns, the undeniable proof. Admiral Vorlag's actions endangered not just Dawn's Fang, but the entire Crisari Empire. He sought to ignite a full-scale war for his own political gain. He projected the intercepted communications, the data trails, the financial transactions that linked Vorlag to the enemy. The evidence was overwhelming. The Crisari elders, renowned for their logical minds, could not deny the cold, hard facts. A palpable shift occurred in the chamber. Whispers broke out, then angry murmurs. The weight of Xander's words, backed by Vena's unwavering conviction and the undeniable data, began to turn the tide. Admiral Vorlag was arrested before the day was out. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Crisari military and political landscape. Chiron was exonerated, though the emotional scars of his ordeal would take time to heal. Vena, far from being stripped of command, was hailed as a hero, her reputation not just restored, but elevated. In the aftermath, the Crisari Empire found itself at a crossroads. The exposure of Vorlag's conspiracy and the critical role a human had played in uncovering it forced a reevaluation of their long-held prejudices. The concept of human inferiority began to crumble under the weight of undeniable proof. Vena, now a celebrated commander, stood before the High Command once more, but this time it was to advocate for a radical change. For centuries, we have defined ourselves by our perceived superiority, she stated, her voice resonating with conviction. We have built an empire on the backs of others, believing our way was the only way. But the events of the past cycles have shown us the folly of such arrogance. Xander, a human, saw what our most decorated strategists could not. He saved our ship, exposed a traitor, and in doing so, he saved us from ourselves. She turned, her emerald eyes meeting Xander's, who stood a respectful distance behind her, no longer a slave, but a consultant, an ally, a partner. It is time, elders, for the Cresari Empire to evolve. It is time to embrace cooperation, to learn from those we once dismissed. It is time for a new era, one built on mutual respect, not subjugation. The High Command deliberated for weeks. The debate was fierce, challenging deeply ingrained beliefs and traditions. But the evidence of Xander's capabilities, the undeniable success of Vena's unconventional tactics, and the sheer magnitude of Vorlog's betrayal ultimately swayed them. A new decree was issued, unprecedented in Cresari history, the abolition of the slave designation for all sentient species. Humans, along with other subjugated races, were granted full rights as citizens of the Cresari Empire. They were offered opportunities for education, military service, and integration into Cresari society. The transition was not without its challenges. Centuries of prejudice would not vanish overnight, but the first crucial step had been taken. Xander, now officially a Cresari citizen and a highly sought-after tactical and engineering consultant, remained aboard Dawn's Fang. He worked closely with Vena, helping to implement the new policies, training human and alien crews side by side, fostering an environment of collaboration that had once been unimaginable. One evening, Xander found Vena on the observation deck, gazing out at the star-streaked void. She was no longer wearing her formal uniform, but a simpler, more comfortable tunic that highlighted the elegant lines of her form. "They've offered me a position on the High Command," she said, her voice soft. "A seat on the Council of Strategists. It would mean leaving Dawn's Fang." Xander turned from the viewport, his hazel eyes meeting hers. "And what do you want to do?" Vena walked towards him, her amber skin luminous in the dim light. "I want to finish what we started, to truly build this new era, but I want to stay here with you." He reached for her, his calloused hands cupping her face. "You can do both, Vena. You can guide the Empire from the highest echelons, and you can still have a life here, with the people you've inspired, with the ship you saved, with me." They drew close, their foreheads resting together in a moment not born of desperation or fear, but of profound trust and shared purpose. It was a gesture that spoke of futures, of possibilities, of a universe where differences of species no longer mattered, only the bonds formed between hearts. "The universe is too vast for any one species to claim superiority over another," Xander murmured against her lips, echoing Chiron's words. "Your brother was right." Vena smiled, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "He would have loved this. He would have loved you." Together, they watched the stars, a human and a Cresari, standing on the precipice of a new dawn. The Dawn's Fang, their ship, their home, continued its journey through the cosmos, no longer a vessel of conquest, but a symbol of hope, of change, and of a love that had defied all odds. The galaxy was still vast, filled with unknown dangers and challenges, but for the first time in a long time, Xander and Vena faced it together, side by side, ready for whatever came next. Their story, once one of master and slave, had transformed into a legend of partnership, of courage, and of a bond that transcended the very stars.